to this very special edition of the Matt and Kendall Hagee podcast. Today, Kendall's not joining me in the studio because I ran in when I knew I had the opportunity to speak with Kelly Shackelford. Now, Kelly serves as the director and the CEO and Chief Counsel for the First Liberty organization. And Kelly, your organization, First Liberty, has a very special responsibility. Tell our listening audience exactly what that is.
First Liberty Institute is the largest nonprofit legal organization in the country that all we do is religious freedom. So we fight in the courts to make sure that we preserve and protect and advance religious freedom for all Americans. And I've been doing this. This is my 30th year to be doing this, and so I've seen quite a change through the years. It's gotten a lot more hostile, and most of the cases we're fighting right now are things that I think most Americans would have never imagined we would have to be fighting.
Well, and you talk about protect, preserve, and advance religious freedom, and when people think about the United States and religious freedom, oftentimes they just assume that it is, protected, it's available, and that there isn't a problem. But as you mentioned, you've been doing this work for 30 years, and here recently, it appears to me, and this is why I think this conversation is so important for the listeners to be aware, that it's kind of an open season on Christianity and Christian values. For lots of reasons, it seems like you can say or do or take action against a Christian, and no one does anything about it in terms of protection from the government or protection that you see extended to other groups.
Yeah, there's a real problem. We categorize and actually do a survey every year of all the attacks on religious freedom just in America. We're not talking about other countries. And it's growing every year. If people want to look at it, it's so thick. It's probably 6 or 7 inches thick if you printed it all out with 5 cases on a page. Everything from a 5-year-old girl who was told to stop praying over her meal because, quote, it's not good to pray at school, to senior citizens who were actually told that their federally funded meals were going to be taken away from them because they were praying over their meals, and that would be a violation of separation of church and state. So it's what you find when you look in this resource. By the way, it's called Undeniable, and just Google Undeniable and First Liberty Institute, you'll find it. And it doesn't matter if you're young, you're old, doesn't matter what part of the country you're in. What you realize as you start just thumbing through this very quickly is this is everywhere. There is no way to avoid these types of attacks, and so it's a wake-up call to some people. And I think if even your listeners, if they start thinking about this, they'll notice 1 or 2 of these every day in the newspaper somewhere. It's happening much more than people think, and of course that's just the tip. That's just what you see in public. In a newspaper, it's happening much more even than that.
Well, and a phrase that I've heard quite often when it comes to basically the decline of values or the decline of society is people say, well, it's a slippery slope. And as you mentioned, 3 decades of service in this area, we've been going down this road for quite a while, and it's now starting to become a lot louder in terms of the direct offense that people are taking with people of Christian faith.
Yeah, I mean, let me give you an example. Just a month ago, we were at the United States Supreme Court arguing a case. Well, what case was that? It was a veterans memorial that was put up 100 years ago by mothers who lost their sons in World War I and the American Legion. Well, why would that be a problem? Because it's a cross. That was the veterans memorial. And the American humanists had filed a lawsuit saying, well, you can't have a veterans memorial that's a cross because that's on government land. And unbelievably, Matt, the Federal Court of Appeals said, that's right, after 100 years, let's tear that down. That's unconstitutional. And that's not only disturbing because of how outrageous that is, but it's by the way, the Court of Appeals judge, during the oral argument, said, why don't we just cut the arms off the cross? That way we don't have to destroy it or move it, yet it won't offend anybody anymore. So this is the kind of mindset we were dealing with. And now we're at the Supreme Court. We argued the case. But think about what this would mean. If you have to tear down that cross, then you have to go into Arlington National Cemetery, which is only 2 miles away, and the large freestanding crosses there have to come down too. And think of whatever community you're listening to this podcast from. Every community of every state of this country has crosses and religious symbols, and they would have to come down. The religious cleansing would be beyond, I think, what anybody could imagine, but that's what we literally were arguing about in the United States Supreme Court. It shows how far we've drifted from what the founders established in this country, the religious freedom and the constitutional protections we have for religious freedom. Good news is we're winning most of these cases, but we're having to fight a lot more than we used to.
Well, and that goes back to that slippery slope idea. You know, when somebody looks at this and they say, well, this is just a Christian issue, it's not a faith issue, it's a freedom issue. And
that's right.
The thing that you'll learn, you know, with just a quick study of history is that whenever a nation began to lose its freedoms on a small level, it eventually led to a government that was dictatorial to the people. You know, they started to remove literature. They started to remove the opportunity to worship as you choose. All of these things that are protected very clearly by our Constitution, they're being infringed upon. And the basis of the infringement is oftentimes somewhat trumped up. For example, you're talking about community by community. Here in San Antonio, my community, recently there was a decision made not to allow a contractor to put together a group of restaurants in the airport extension that was going to be added to the San Antonio airport, because one of the restaurants that he wanted to put fundamentally, I guess, in the food court, you'd call it, was going to be a Chick-fil-A. And once Chick-fil-A was removed from the restaurants that were going to be put in the food court, the contract was then awarded. So, you know, this individual who engages the city of San Antonio and wants to do the work because he's chosen an organization that the city council decided was discriminatory against the LGBTQ community, that he wasn't going to get that contract until he changed his position on doing business with that organization. That is such a stretch of the imagination that would happen in a free society like the United States. But not only did it happened right here in my hometown.
Things like that are happening in everybody who's listening in their hometown. And your situation there is even more extreme in ways, because Chick-fil-A doesn't refuse to serve anybody. They serve everybody. What they're being attacked for by the city of San Antonio, the city council, is that their owners are Christian, and their owners have a private foundation where they give money. And these are the two groups they called out. They said they give money to groups like, quote, the Salvation Army and the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So evidently, if you're a Christian owner of a business and you, in your own private life, you give to Christian causes, like maybe your church, the city can now refuse to award you contracts and refuse to do business with you. I mean, again, that is totally unconstitutional. That is religious discrimination. It violates the First Amendment. It also violates, as we pointed out in your case in San Antonio, to the Department of Transportation. They get federal funding for these airport extensions, et cetera, and it's a requirement. You cannot engage in religious discrimination or religious bigotry and receive federal money. So they've got to either change what they're doing, or they're going to have the federal government, in our opinion, take grants and funding away, because what they're doing is wrong and it's unconstitutional.
Well, and even to that end, on this very day, this morning, Pastor Hagee was joined by several other pastors in the San Antonio area to go to City Hall, because City Hall, based on the amount of pressure they have received really on a national scale, they've not only gotten scrutinized by the Texas Attorney General, but, for example, First Liberty Institute, your organization, appealed to the Department of Transportation to look into the situation. So they decided, well, maybe we should look at this again. And when Pastor and the other group of faith leaders in the city came to the council meeting, they were not allowed to speak, which, you know, that in and of itself kind of gives you an understanding of how willing the aggressive government is against faith and people of faith, that when they come to exercise their rights as citizens, they're not afforded those rights.
Yeah, I think that's just so appropriate. You look at that and you think, not only are they engaging in religious discrimination, but when pastors want to get up and say something about it, they refuse to allow them to speak. This is a city that's lost its way, a city council that's lost its way and doesn't seem to understand that they're servants. I think they realize, I hope they realize they've made a horrible mistake. And by the way, some people, where can I get information on this? If they go to First Liberty, you can just spell out firstliberty.org. Right at the top of our page, it talks about Chick-fil-A. It says click here if you want to read more. You can read the letter that we sent to the Department of Transportation about how they violated the law. You can, there's lots of stories on this, USA Today, et cetera. This is something that's really been around the country. But I think what you're pointing out, Matt, is this is what's happening. This is the kind of thing happening everywhere. And I would just encourage people, stand your ground. Don't let religious freedom be taken away because you're silent. I mean, I'm so thankful that Pastor Hagee and these other ministers and leaders were not going to sit silent. This is wrong. What they were doing was wrong. And silence in the face of evil is sin. And we have to be, our manner needs to be Christ-like, but not, people mix up all the time. They think, well, being Christ-like means you don't stand. No, it means you stand for what's right. You just do it in a Christ-like manner. But standing is not an option for Christians or not standing. And so I'm so grateful for what you guys are doing because that's the example and the model that everybody around the country needs to be doing to make sure that we preserve the wonderful country that we were given.
Well, and it is about preserving the nation and its values for everybody. Christian people and those who don't have any faith. But I think that, you've said it well, we have to do it together. Pastors and faith leaders have got to stand up and speak up, and organizations like First Liberty Institute have got to take the battle on the legal front lines because without people in the community supporting the work that you're doing and without the work that you're doing inside the courts, we're just going to continue to lose ground on these very important issues. And, you've seen it in 30 years of your service. I'm a father of 4 children, and one of the things that really engages me in this cause is the idea that one day, if God tarries, my grandchildren are going to be in this world, and what kind of nation are they going to live in? One of the things that I'm bothered by is that up until now, I've always felt as if a generation that was coming up could look at a generation that had been, and I could look at my grandfather and tell him that we lived in a better United States than he grew up in. He grew up in the Depression. He fought through World War II with his generation and saw all of those challenges. As a child of the late 70s, early 80s, and the things that were happening in America at the time, we lived in a much better time than he knew as a child. I don't know that that's going to continue if we don't have a significant change in direction as a nation. That being said, it begins at the local level. It begins when people understand who is their city councilman, what does their city councilman stand for? Because this situation here in San Antonio was fundamentally driven by one particular city councilman who decided that a business was discriminatory. That in and of itself is ridiculous.
Yeah, and they don't. I mean, Chick-fil-A serves everybody. There's no proof of anything. It's just this thing is all false. What they essentially said was that if you're a Christian and you run your business, even if your business doesn't do anything, we're going to look in. We, the government, are going to look into who you give to, what Christian causes, and if we don't like that, we're going to then, box you out of being able to do business in the city. I mean,
that's more like communism than it is democracy.
It is. And boy, people have to speak up, and so I'm grateful, that they have. And look, I would point out, this is certainly, these attacks are on people of faith, but I know how important to.
But when we say people of faith, I think it's even more important that we say Bible-believing Christians. Because, Islam is a faith. I'm certain that if this was an action taken against a person from the Muslim community with Islamic beliefs, there would be an outroar on the opposite end of the spectrum about how bigoted it was to do so.
Absolutely. And the reason I mentioned people of faith is because the one other group that's really getting attacked are people who are Jewish.
Correct.
We have numerous cases right now across the country where synagogues are under attack in the United States. They're trying to close them down. They're attack. We have one right now in Airmont, New York, where they, in order to get rid of the Orthodox Jews in that community, they've actually come up with regulations in the city that say you cannot use your own home for a religious meeting if you're over a certain percentage. So, like, if you use 20% of your home for a religious meeting, and they're literally having to measure their bookcases that have religious books in them, then you're not allowed to meet. This is their way to get rid of Orthodox Jews, but of course you and I both know what that would do to Bible studies and everything else.
Absolutely.
But it's incredible what we're having to deal with, and we've got cases in Los Angeles, in Dallas, in New York. I mean, so it's not any one part of the country, all just defending the right of Jewish synagogues to exist. So it seems to be that the attacks are always against people who are Christians or Jewish in this country. And there are other faiths, but they don't seem to get the attacks that those who are either Christian or Jewish do.
Yeah, and if you put that in its historical context, you know, the regime that took over Germany underneath the leadership of Adolf Hitler, it isolated people who fundamentally had a very core biblical faith. I mean, you referenced earlier a statement about seeing evil and not calling it evil. You know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor in Germany at the time, that's his famous phrase: to see evil and not call it evil is evil. And what he was doing was standing up and speaking up against Nazism, and it fundamentally cost him his life. But at the same time, he was taking a stand at a time when it was very important to do so. And then later, only after the world saw the horrific impact of Nazism, did the whole entire world take a stand. You know, it's something that is of concern, and I think it's a wake-up call for people who, you know, I don't know that they ignore it, but I think they get so busy in the life that they live that it's just not seen and it's not heard, and it's something that they need to be aware of, that this is happening, and it's important that it stop happening so that we can preserve the freedom that we have as a United States enjoyed for more than 250 years.
Well, we had 447 cases last year alone, and it just shows you how prolific this is. But so you can't go through all of those, but I'll just give one that's an example of the kind of battle we're in right now, and that's one that a lot of people have heard of. It's the Coach Kennedy case. This is a coach who was a Marine for 20 years, and the night after getting out of the Marines, the night before he went to his first coaching job, he saw a movie, Facing the Giants, which is about Christians and coaching, and it convicted him. And he made a promise to God. He said, you know what, after every game, when we go to the center of the field and shake the other team's hand, the first thing I'm going to do is go to a knee and thank you for the privilege of coaching these young men. That's what he did for 7 years until the school sent him a letter and said, if you go to a knee again, we're going to fire you. And he made a pledge to God, so he went to a knee, and they fired him. And the Ninth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, which is known as probably the most liberal or hostile to religion in the country, it's out of San Francisco, ruled that coaches are not allowed to pray in public, quote, if anyone can see them. And
so what's the definition of public then?
Yeah, well, anybody can see you, then you can't pray as a coach, which is just outrageous. We've got a good decision recently from the Supreme Court on this. This case is still going, but I bring this out to point out this coach, when you get to know and see this coach, the kids love this coach. The parents love this coach because he loves these kids, and he gives everything he got. And so the idea that the guy we're attacking in this society right now is the guy who goes to a knee after the game to just thank God for the privilege of being able to coach these young men. I mean, this is what we're dreaming for a coach for our kids, right? This is what we're praying for, and that's the guy who gets attacked. And it just shows the battle we're in right now in our culture, and we've just got to have people stand with people like Coach Kennedy. We need more Coach Kennedys in this country, but it won't happen unless we're willing to stand with the Coach Kennedys and say,
absolutely,
you're not getting rid of this type of guy, not in my community.
We've got to get around individuals like that and make it too difficult for them to be removed from their place of influence. Kelly, with the time we have left, I think it's important that we allow our listeners to understand how they can take part in what needs to be done. And one of the first things that comes to my mind is vote. Because, for example, here in the city of San Antonio, people would ask, well, how did that city get a city council like it has that would take such a ridiculous position? The truth is less than 10% of this city's population went to the polls in our last election. And when you have so few people go vote, it's very easy for one particular group to push an agenda over millions of people. In San Antonio, there's more than 2 million people. And, if you organize a special interest group that wants to see a particular style of government, it's very easy to do when voter turnout is low. It's a lot harder to do when voter turnout is high. And so I think, speaking to the listener that's out there, right now you're working with the current presidential administration on identifying qualified judges and helping them understand how people that are appointed to the bench are going to discern the law of the land for the next generation. And again, to me, that goes right back to the vote. If they don't show up and vote in an election to preserve a government that they appreciate, a lot of things are going to come unraveled very quickly, and that slippery slope is not going to be a slippery slope. It could turn into a deadfall.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, for instance, one of the things we're doing is the judges. If they go to firstliberty.org and go to the bottom of the page, judicial nominees, they can watch all these judicial seats being filled for life by the current president. And what's been happening on the courts has been phenomenal. I mean, the number of strong, believing Christians that are going onto the court for life is really, I've never seen anything like it. And so we're affecting the next, decades, 30 years from now. These are the judges that your grandkids are going to come before. But that takes people, that actually make this a priority. And it was something that the Christian community all over the country said, we're tired of these judges taking issues out of their hands, not following the Constitution, doing all these things. We want to start asking our candidates about what kind of judges. And so that's why we're getting this. And I would point out, we have a little resource that talks about churches and elections, what's the law. And churches can do lots of great things with regard to elections. They can, they can make sure everybody's registered to vote. They can talk about what kind of values people vote on. They can talk about any political issue they want and bring the Bible to bear on those things. They can pass out voters' guides that are, nonpartisan voters' guides that say, here's where the candidates stand on all the issues. They can even invite the candidates to their church. If they invite all the candidates in a race and only one shows up, they've done what they're supposed to do. So the church can do a great job of equipping the saints to represent Christ in the voting booth, which is what they're supposed to do. And like you say, a lot of these elections, like these city council elections, in many, many communities, it's such a small turnout that we've seen that even one church can totally change the city by just saying, we are going to do our good stewardship in voting and in voting for elected officials. And in fact, I've even seen a number of churches say, you know what, we don't see any good candidates who stand, on what is right and moral and good and biblical. We're going to encourage some people in our church to run, and we've seen
such
an
important point is getting a qualified candidate. Yes, voting is something that every individual, I believe, has a responsibility to do as a steward of fellowship and freedom and family values. But also, most of the time when you go to the voting booth, you're not necessarily voting for a candidate, you're just voting against the worst candidate. And the way that you change that is you get a qualified individual who can make an impact in public service. And I think that that's something that churches need to be aware of and community leaders need to be aware of, to identify young people. There's a millennial move that's coming into government, and right now it's going in the wrong direction because, the values that are present aren't Christian values, they're not faith-based values, and the only way to define them in many cases is absurd. But if the faith community does not encourage its best and its brightest to combat that, we're going to forfeit the ground.
Absolutely. Look, somebody is gonna be in control. Somebody's values are going to be in control, and we've been given an incredible gift in this country of the freedoms, including the religious freedoms that we were given by those who came before us. But God's looking at us and saying, it reminds me of the parable where He gives the vineyard to somebody. They dig a trench, they build a tower, they do everything for the vineyard, and they just ask Him to take care of it. And they come back and they don't. In fact, they end up attacking, the owner of the vineyard. And, we've got a responsibility here. I mean, we've got stewardship for our kids and our grandkids. And here's the good news, because a lot of this we're talking about, there's a lot of these attacks, and it can seem pretty down. The good news is we're winning these cases. I mean, 90%, 18 years in a row, we've won over 90% of our cases. The law is on our side in this country. This country was built on religious freedom, and in fact, I'm going to say something, Matt, that a lot of people would be shocked by, but because of the judges we're getting on the court, including the Supreme Court, guys like Kavanaugh, who donated time with me on a religious liberty case 20 years ago as a young attorney, because of these judges we're getting on the court, we're starting to move religious freedom law in a way where I truly believe in the very near future, every living American is going to have more religious freedom in this country than they've ever had. We're about to get rid of some bad cases, move things back to more freedom, and there are incredible good things that God is doing, but He's doing that so that we can exercise that freedom and make a difference in people's lives in this country.
And He's doing it through the work of individuals like yourself. Is God moving? Absolutely, but He always moves through His people that are in a given area at a given time. And if some of our listeners want to be able to join the work that you're doing and the movement that you are bringing for people of faith back to the United States, the best way to do that is look you guys up online. Give us that web address one more time.
You just spell it out, firstliberty.org, firstliberty.org, and about halfway down the page it says Become an Insider, and click on that, and you'll start getting an email every 2 weeks, and you'll be in the know. You'll be able to pray about what's going on. You'll be able to inform your friends, and even encourage them to be bolder, because many people are scared to exercise their faith because they don't know what their rights are. And so the more we can really embolden people with the freedoms they really have, the more people are going to live stronger for the Lord.
Absolutely. Kind of close with this. Benjamin Franklin made a statement whenever the Constitutional Congress met in Pennsylvania to decide what we would have. And the question was asked, what kind of government do we have? And his response was, a republic, if you can keep it. And I think it's this generation's challenge to make sure that we keep the republic that we have been entrusted with. And you're certainly on the front lines of that, Kelly. Thank you for joining us here on the podcast today. And we hope that you guys continue to experience great success in the work that you do.
Oh, thank you, Matt, and thank you so much for what y'all do and what you stand for all over the world.
Well, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for joining us today.
God bless you.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed listening to the conversation that I just had with Kelly Shackelford from First Liberty. And if you would like to, you can check out his website and become more informed and aware of the situation that Christians are facing in the United States. It's important that we as believers are not only aware and informed, but that we're active. And what I want to encourage you to do if you listen to this podcast today is find a place where you can be active. For some of you, that's simply going to be in prayer. The Bible says in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 that, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, then I'll hear from heaven and heal their land. So for some of us, the activity is going to be prayer-based. For others, it's going to be finding a way to get involved in public service in your local community. For others, it's going to be coming alongside people like Kelly and his organization and discovering ways that you can make a difference. We're talking about making a difference in your everyday life. Well, things you can do on a daily basis can not only make a difference in your everyday life, but they can make a difference for generations to come if you will take action when action is required. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. I look forward to having an opportunity to share with you again in the future. If you'd like to, you can subscribe to this podcast. It's the Matt and Kendall Hagee podcast, and we look forward to having the opportunity to make a difference in your everyday life again very soon.